Hey Tom, I had a call this afternoon from a customer that wants to put strain gauges on concrete. He said it's kind of a rougher surface. What recommendations would you have for putting gauges on surfaces like concrete that may be a little porous or a little bit rougher to the touch?
Well, probably what I'd recommend, depending upon the structure itself and how this would affect it, is some sort of filler like AE10 or GA2. You do a pre-coat onto the concrete, pre-filling the gaps and voids in there, allow that to fully cure, and then you come back and sand away the excess until you just expose the parent material underneath it. This is good for concrete structures, gray cast iron, very rough surfaces that cannot be machined away because you might change the integrity of the part. So pre-filling with GA2 or AE10, both of which are 100% solids epoxies and fairly viscous, tends to help you level that surface up because strain gauges can't be applied to such a rough surface. The change in elevation would poke little holes in the backing.
Understood, understood. So once you use the adhesive, I think it has a pre-coat. After you do that, what would you use to glue the gauge on then?
Well, that would depend primarily on the application and the size of the gauge. You could just use M-Bond 200 if the application says you're putting down a half-inch long strain gauge and you can slap it down and hold it down with your thumb. M-Bond 200 within the parameters of the adhesive, both temperature and elongation, might be a good choice. You could also use the AE10 or GA2 as the adhesive system too. After you've done the pre-coat, then you clamp it up appropriately, squeeze out the excess material, and have a properly thin and hard bond line.
It sort of sounds like you're playing a balancing act.
Yeah, you kind of have to balance between the surfaces being too irregular and the ability to properly bond the strain gauge. The balancing act is you don't want to over reinforce the part either because you're adding epoxy to it. And that may change the characteristics on a very thin section. But if you're working on a gray cast iron suspension hanger on a truck, you can remove a lot of material and it's not going to hurt it. But if you're working on a very thin specimen or something that could be affected structurally by removing or adding that material, you could run into some problems. So reinforcement can be an issue, but it's rarely in concrete or steel structures.
Okay, and you mentioned about sanding it once it's cured. I assume the reason for that is you're trying to minimize how thick you build up the glue line.
Absolutely. If that bond line is too thick because the AE10 wasn't sanded back to the surface, then you would have excessive creep potentially, some viscoelastic behavior of the bond line that might give you the lower than actual strain readings. And if my strain gauge is ever going to lie to me, make sure it lies to me high, not low. Okay, well, I want to make sure that when I get that reading and I give it to people who are analyzing the data, that they're analyzing it with real numbers rather than something that would be artificially low but due to a thick bond line. What I do is take a piece of the PCT 2M tape after I put down the pre-coat and I squeegee it back and forth and then tape it down so it makes a little road bed. That limits the
Okay.
amount of sanding that you have to do to remove that material and actually makes it a little smoother too. Don't clamp it up though because you'll put the voids right back in there.
Okay, that's a great tip. So you're using the tape essentially to create a smooth layer and minimizing how much after it cures that you have to go back and sand it.
Exactly. You don't want to have to sand through a quarter of an inch of the adhesive to get to the part. You want to sand through a couple of few thousandths rather than, a lot.
Okay, those are some great suggestions. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome, Darryl.